Welcome, children, to Levy Story Time. This is the story called Leroy and the Horriful Stankness. Leroy Jones was a strong little boy.
Really strong.
He was wild and free, and he loved getting dirty.
Dirty, really dirty.
Leroy only had one weakness. And that weakness was Sunday clothes. Every Sunday morning, Mama would wake him up early and bathe the wonderful filth right off him. He would try not to scream. Then she would dress him in his crisp, clean Sunday clothes and shiny Sunday shoes. He would bite his lip. Then she would pull the comb through his knotty, tangly hair and make it into a puffy black ball. He would grit his teeth. Then, worst of all, she would sit him down on the couch and say, "Leroy, my son, I want you to sit right here until church.
Why?
I
Why?
don't want you getting stanky. I don't want you getting smudgy. I don't want you getting filthy, or so help me."
But why?
When Mama said, "So help me," it meant she was dead serious. You didn't mess with Mama when she said that. You just did exactly what she said. Leroy didn't even know what "so help me" meant, and he didn't want to find out. Maybe it meant she would need someone to come help her calm down, or help her build a cage to put him in, or help her create a bonfire for all his toys. Leroy shuddered. No thanks. He would just obey. And it wasn't just that. Deep down, Leroy loved his mama more than anyone in the world. Deep down in his heart, he wanted to obey her. Not just because he was scared of "so help me," but because he truly loved her. He looked in her eyes with all his love and said, "Mama, I promise I won't get dirty. Can I at least go outside?" He smiled his best "pretty please" smile. That worked sometimes. She stared at him for a moment, thinking. Then she smiled. "Okay, Leroy,
You can go outside.
but be extra careful to stay clean, or so help me."
So help me.
Leroy was off like a shot and barely heard the words coming out of her mouth. He went out to the backyard and started pacing around. It was so boring.
Ugh.
There was so much you couldn't do in your Sunday clothes.
You can't even play on the jungle gym.
Like everything, right? You couldn't play on the jungle gym, or roll in the dirt, or jump in puddles. He felt like a starving man watching food shows on TV. But it was better than sitting in the house, at least. All of a sudden, he saw something, like a shape.
Like a big ball of gas floating.
Big
And it
puffy
got
shape.
closer and closer
A puffy
until
green
it got
shape.
closer and closer
Closer?
until it got right in front of him.
It was kind of like a big ball of green smoke with a face. A face with big eyes and a big nose and a big smile full of yellowish and grayish teeth.
Teeth.
It
Blech.
floated closer and closer. Leroy wrinkled his nose. The green smoke thing smelled horrible.
Blech.
He,
Be you.
he stopped right in front of Leroy. "Well, hey there," said the green smoke thing. Leroy's mama had taught him to be polite, so he said, "Hello." They were quiet for a moment. "My name is Stankness," he said. "D. Horriful Stankness. What's your name, young man?" "Leroy Jones," said Leroy. "Are those Sunday clothes?" asked Stankness. "I love Sunday clothes," he said, rolling his eyes like he just licked a lollipop. Leroy's brow furrowed. "I hate Sunday clothes. They are my worst enemy." Said Stankness. Then his eyes lit up like he had the best idea ever. "Leroy, do you like to make mud pies?" Leroy's face lit up too. I make the best mud pies, Leroy grinned. Not better than mine, Stankness chuckled good-naturedly. You want to see who can make the biggest, sloppiest, ploppiest mud pie? You're on, shouted Leroy. He took one step towards the muddy spot in the backyard. Then he stopped in his tracks. And he remembered that Mama said, so
help me.
And deep down in his heart, he loved his mama and wanted to obey. Wait, I can't do that, Mr. Stankness. I promised my mama I would stay clean, he said with a sigh. Oh, yes, I understand. I have a mama too. I know how it is. You are a good little boy. No trouble, Bubba. No trouble at all, said Stankness. They just stood there in silence for a while. Leroy drew a line in the dirt with the bottom of his shoe. Horriful Stankness gasped. What the bubble skunk? What? Asked Leroy, looking around. Horriful Stankness caught himself and just shook his gassy head. Oh, nothing, little guy. Nothing at all. Leroy just stared with a look that meant, hey, let's not have secrets. Horriful Stankness looked left. He looked right. You see that sloppy, squelching mud puddle over there? Shouldn't somebody be stomping up and down in that? Leroy saw it. Oh, did he ever. He loved stomping in mud puddles. He loved the wet thunk and the cold spray of sludge and muddy slime up his legs. He ran 2 steps towards the big muddy puddle near the elm tree. Then he stopped in his tracks, and he remembered that Mama said, so help me. And deep down in his heart, he loved his mama and wanted to obey. Wait, I can't do that, Mr. Stankness. I promised my mama I wouldn't muddy up my Sunday clothes, he said with a sigh. Horrible Stankness got a sad look on his face. Of course. I forgot about that. You are a good little boy, trying so hard to obey your mama. No trouble, Bubba. No trouble at all. I guess that poor puddle will have to dry up with no one to stomp in it. Poor mud puddle. Poor, lonely mud puddle. They just stood there in silence for a while. Leroy put his hands in his 2 tight Sunday pockets and tried to whistle a sad song, but he couldn't whistle very well. What the whiffle stank? Shouted Stankness. Did you see that? What? Cried Leroy. I saw something just run under that rock over there. Should we go lift up that rock and see what it is? Asked Stankness. Leroy loved catching critters, even more than mud puddles and mud pies. Catching critters is the best, he whispered. He ran 3 steps towards the rocks near the fence. Then he stopped in his tracks, and he remembered that Mama said, so help me. And deep down in his heart, he loved his mama, and he wanted to obey. Wait, I can't do that, Mr. Stankness. I promised my mama I wouldn't smudge up my Sunday clothes, he said with a sigh. Stankness looked very, very sad for Leroy. Oh, I agree, Leroy. You need to obey your mama. But still, I think your mama would want you to know what's under that rock. In fact, I think she would want to know what's under that rock. And that rock looks pretty clean. I don't think you'll get dirty just picking up one little tiny rock, do you? Leroy thought for a minute. That all sounded right and made sense to him. But what he didn't know was that once you started playing with Stankness, it was almost impossible to stop. And I think you probably know what happened next. Leroy didn't just pick up the rock. He ended up running all around with the Stankness, and he forgot his promise to his mama. After a while, Stankness stopped and smiled. Well, that about does it, he said. I sure do love those Sunday clothes, he said, rolling his eyes like he was licking a lollipop. Then Stankness gave kind of a mean laugh. Ha ha ha! Works every time. Then he looked at Leroy and said, "Tell your mama that deep, horrible Stankness says hello." Then he began floating away, cackling as he went. Leroy began to think that maybe Stankness was not as nice of a stinky green cloud thing as he might have thought he was. Then Leroy looked down at his hands. They were filthy. He looked down at his pants. They were muddy. He looked down at his shirt. It was
smudgy.
He looked down at his shoes. They were nasty. Then he remembered his mama. He remembered, "So help me," and a bolt of fear shot down his spine. He remembered his promise, and sadness washed over him. And he did what all little boys do when they break their promise to their mama who they really, really love and wanted to obey. He hid in a closet. Now, his mama went looking for him, as mamas do, and she found him in that closet. And when she saw him, her eyes got very wide, which was scary, and her voice got really slow and quiet, which was even more scary. "Leroy," she said, just above a whisper, "you are absolutely filthy." Leroy was a strong little boy, but this was too much for him. He burst into tears. "I'm sorry, Mama. I'm so sorry. I tried, Mama. I tried. That mean old Stankness tricked me. Please don't put me in a cage, Mama. Please don't put my toys in a bonfire, Mama. But I deserve it if you do. Oh, Mama." She stared for a moment, like she was thinking. "Did you say Stankness?" she asked. "You mean D. Horriful Stankness?" Leroy nodded. "I've heard of him," she said. "I've heard that he is very, very tricky, especially when it comes to little boys in their Sunday clothes." She knelt down and got in the closet with him and wrapped him up in her arms. This got his stanky dirt all over her Sunday clothes, too. Leroy was very upset because he loved her very much. She rocked him back and forth and whispered, "Shh," into his filthy hair. "I want you to learn one thing, my son, and it's very important," she said. Leroy sniffed. "Never play with Mr. Stankness," he said. "Even more important than that," said Mama. "I want you to know that you never, ever, 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 ever have to hide from me." "Do you know why?" she asked. "Why, Mama?" He wiped his eyes. "Because no matter how filthy you get, or stanky, or smudgy, even if you ruin your Sunday clothes, I only love you. I only ever love you. I'm always on your side." Leroy nodded. He knew that deep, deep down in his heart. But it was good to be reminded. The end. Here's a special note from Leroy. Listen carefully. "Beware of Mr. Stankness. He is very, very tricky. If you see a green cloud of smoke and he says any of these things, be careful. He's trying to trick you." "I sure do love those Sunday clothes." "No trouble, Bubba. No trouble at all." "What the bumble skunk was that? What the whiffle stank? What the swamp gas? Do you like mud pies? You janky little whiffle sniff. What the pumple dump? What the dump truck? What the jungle funk? Hey, let's go play in that mud puddle. What the monkey stank? What the skunk plunk? What the fumble junk? What the bubble skunk? What the garbage gunk? Do you like garbage soup? Rah! Ah! Ha 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 ha! Works every time.